I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. I believe that my liver is diseased. However, I know nothing at all about my disease, and I do not know for certain what ails me. I don't consult a doctor for it and never have, though I have a respect for medicine and doctors. Besides, I am extremely superstitious, sufficiently so to respect medicine. I'm well educated enough not to be superstitious, but I am superstitious. No, I refuse to consult a doctor from spite. That you probably will not understand. Well, I understand it though. Of course, I can't explain who it is precisely that I am mortifying in this case by my spite. I am perfectly well aware that I cannot, quote, pay out the doctors by not consulting them. I know better than anyone that by all of this I'm only injuring myself and no one else. But still, if I don't consult a doctor, it is from spite. My liver is bad. Well, let it get worse. Okay, so with that inspirational little reading, let's dig into some of the main themes in this book. Basically, there are going to be two main themes in the first half of this book, which is what your reading assignment is going to be about. So here on my left and your right is a reading assignment from Notes to the Underground. Now, here's the deal about that. There are many different versions of this book, many different translations into English, and the pages do not map onto each other at all. I have the Dover Thrift Edition, where the page numbers for your reading assignment run from 1 to 28. But basically, your reading assignment is up to the point where there's a section that says, apropos of the wet snow. So read up to there. You don't need to read into the second section, although I'll make mention of a few themes from the second section, but it's not part of your reading assignment. All right, so two main themes from your reading assignment, and then I want to look at another main theme from the second half of the book when we get to the end of that. So let's start off with the two main themes from the first half of the book. There they are, mentioned in your notes. So, first theme has to do with the meaning of freedom and how it is that genuine freedom must necessarily pass beyond the confines of what seems reasonable and what would make us happy. That genuine freedom is a much wider and much more inclusive construct than mere reason, even when it's conjoined with the project of making humanity happier. So that's the first big theme. And the second big theme is the one that was probably obvious in that reading that I gave to you a second ago, and that is spite. So the question is, how do existentialists think about spite and related constructs, especially in terms of the motif of existential defiance? So basically, the two main themes are the meaning of freedom and then what is existential defiance. So that's a little bit of spoiler, I guess, for this first half of the book. So let's dig into those one after the other. So freedom first. Here's the essential question. Are we genuinely free if all we ever choose in our lives is what we think is rational and reasonable, and what, as a consequence, will tend to make us and the people around us happy? So, are we genuinely free if all we ever pick in our lives is what we think will make us happy by way of what is rational and reasonable? Okay, so let's take an example, kind of an everyday life example. Let's say you go into the supermarket and you're looking for cereal. You're looking for breakfast cereal. And so you look at the long row of breakfast cereals in the supermarket, and you need to make a choice. Remember, this is about freedom. You need to make a choice about what breakfast cereal you're going to buy. Are you genuinely free in that sort of microcosmic situation if all you ever pick is the cereal that you think would taste the best and or be the most nutritious. In other words, the thing that would sort of optimize your happiness insofar as you can predict that in terms of taste and perhaps nutrition too. And Dostoyevsky's answer to that question is going to be not really. You're not really free if that's all you ever do. And the reason why is because really that vision of freedom boils down, when you think about it, to the process, the cognitive process that you use to estimate the projected benefits that you think would happen. So if you think, well, I like sugar, and so I'm going to find the sugariest cereal in the row. Well, when I was a kid, what I thought was the sugariest cereal would probably be Lucky Charms. Like Lucky Charms. After all, they were magically delicious. So if I were sort of in that breakfast aisle and I were thinking, I want to intake a lot of sugar, okay, so cognitively I'd be sort of trying to gauge what each cereal has in terms of sugar content and how sweet it would taste and how wonderful it would be to taste it the next morning. But the process of picking the cereal would basically be based on that process of estimating the projected benefits of each of the possible choices. So I'd go through and I'd look at shredded wheat, and I would probably say, especially if I was a kid, not really, because there's not much sugar in that. That's more of a grown-up type cereal. And I would think of maybe Cheerios, and that I'd think something like, well, that's a little bit better, but really Lucky Charms would be the one. But the trick here, the thing I really want you to get, is that really, in a way, your process of estimation is, in a sense, what's making the choice for you. It's not in a way that you're making the choice. It's that sort of cognitive process, a kind of calculus, as it were, like a kind of mathematics. Like you could almost envision in our era how an AI program might try to replicate that process by way of some probably complex mathematical manipulation of different variables to produce perhaps a sweetness coefficient at the end. And so you would automatically pick the one with the highest sweetness coefficient. And so the sort of terroristic logic is that, well, how are we any different from that? And Dostoyevsky's answer to that is going to be, well, we're only different from that insofar as it points we defy that kind of calculus. Like at points we actually pick something that we don't necessarily want, that we make a kind of negative choice in our lives. And this is a tough argument to get across, especially to undergraduate classes, like how it is that we've basically been sold a counterfeit vision of what our freedom really is. It's a tough argument because the vision we've been sold more or less says, well, you always pick what makes you happy, or at least what you think will make you happy, that's what your freedom is. And Dostoyevsky's argument is that, well, yeah, that's actually pretty mechanical. He compares it to it's a 19th century metaphor. He compares it to an organ stop or piano keys. It's sort of like that, in the 19th century, they didn't have metaphors like the robot or AI or anything like that. So he went with what he had, and what he had in terms of a metaphor that would represent a kind of mechanical process was you hit keys on the piano and it produces a certain set of notes or chords or progressions or what have you. You pull organ stops out to alter the sound of the organ. I don't know, you might have to sort of look up what an older organ looks like, because it's sort of, there's not much equivalent in today's world in terms of, musical instruments. But at any rate, the point is that for Dostoyevsky, for freedom to be real, for freedom to be genuine, it has to extend itself out across the outer boundary of everything we would think of as rational and reasonable and what would bring us happiness. It has to extend out into regions of unreason and pain and suffering, in short, into the negative regions of life. Like if our choices never enter into those sort of difficult, dark, foreboding possibilities of existence, then our freedom is a sham. It's a kind of lie that we tell ourselves, but it has no real substance. And the reason why is because, in a sense, all of our choices, which would ultimately constitute the basis of our freedom, are mechanical and preordained in much the same way that pressing a piano key would produce, let's say, an F sharp note or whatever other note that you're pressing. Let's go with middle C, because that's the one people are familiar with. All right, so this runs against the grain of a lot of how we think about life in the modern era, and a lot about how the Western intellectual trajectory has thought about freedom and the meaning of life. For instance, you may be familiar with some British utilitarian philosophy that held that, well, ultimately the ethical good is what produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So this is an idea from thinkers like Jeremy Bentham. And the way he described it was in terms of an ongoing calculus of felicity, that how we spend our lives is ongoingly, under the surface, we're not sort of aware we're doing this, is sort of calculating, in a sense, what we think will make ourselves happy and make the people around us happy. And ultimately, the ethical good is based upon that ongoing calculus of felicity is the phrase that he used. So calculus of felicity. Felicity means happiness. It's sort of a fancy word for happiness. Another vision of life that organizes itself around happiness is the eudaimonia of classical Greek antiquity. For instance, in Aristotle, we find eudaimonia, which is basically in Greek what that means is like kind of good spirits, you might say. Good spirits that would ultimately form the basis of any sort of virtue. That virtue is ultimately based in what brings about greater human happiness. It's also an idea that you can find within the purview of psychology in behavioral psychology, that basically, everything psychological, according to old school behaviorism, is basically you can boil it down to our attempts to get what we want. And Dostoyevsky's response, and I would say existentialism's response to that is, well, all of that's important. Our efforts to be happy, our efforts to get what we want, to fulfill our desires, that's incontestably an important part of human reality. But an equally important part of human reality is everything that would seem to be the antithesis of that. Everything that seems dark, everything that seems destructive, everything that seems intimidating, everything that seems scary and addictive, and so on. Like all of the various, and there are many regions of darkness that ultimately form part of the human experience and the human soul. Well, all of that too is part and parcel of what we're going through. And if freedom is fundamental to our human condition, then freedom also must play across that terrain. And that's basically the gist of Dostoyevsky's argument in the first half of the book with respect to that. Now, here's the trick. Here's the trick to understanding this. You have to sort of go through a process of deflating some of the easy responses to this, because here's an easy response. Well, I can easily pick something negative that I don't necessarily want, something painful, when I think that picking that will ultimately give me something that I do want. For instance, for a long time I was a runner, and if you're a runner, there's a fair amount of pain in that sport. In fact, there's a lot of pain in that sport. And if you're a runner, you're willing to choose something that is, in a very primitive and physical way, very painful, because what you're really after is something beyond that pain, a kind of happiness beyond that pain. And the happiness has to do with, well, a bunch of things, like feeling physically fit, enjoying being fast. If you're a runner and you're running for time, you enjoy being a fast runner, and you enjoy the pleasures of the body that accrue from being physically fit and all of that. Well, to really get the point of Dostoevsky's argument, you got to pass beyond all that, because he's not talking about choices that we make that seem painful on the surface, but that are really governed by a will to some happiness in the future that we hope to get. He's talking about choices that we make that defy all of that kind of logic. They're the ones that we make that are sort of purely negative or purely destructive. And here, like if you're following along, it can be sort of hard to identify in your life where you've made those sorts of choices, because there's always a kind of skeptical position wherein you could look at what seem to be painful choices and rationalize them in terms of some sort of attempt to gain some future happiness or some future benefit or some future advantage that you project off into some possible future. He's not talking about that. He's talking about the ones you make for no damn good reason whatsoever. The ones that are purely about pain and nothing else. So let's try to conjure a sense for what that might even look like, because it's not necessarily obvious. Well, since I'm talking mostly to college students here, if you've ever, let's say, let's say you go to a party and you're drinking a whole bunch of beer. Yeah, I know. It's a big hypothetical step to take, but hang with me. Let's say you go to a party and you're drinking beer, and as you're drinking beer, you're feeling a little bit looser, and like you're laughing and you're louder and you're having more fun, and it's really a fun time for a while. But I'm guessing that most of you who are listening to this know that at some point in the drinking process, the fun goes away. At some point, you can look into the glass and know that the next drink isn't about optimizing your happiness or your pleasure or anything like that, the amount of fun you're having. The next drink is about pain. And you know it. Like at some level, you know it. And sometimes you drink anyhow. And that's sort of we're starting to enter into sort of dark territory here, the territory of addictive behavior and self-destructive behavior. Well, the thing about self-destructive behavior is that it's a very common thing. We don't normally like to think of it that way, but it actually is. Most of the time, and maybe this is a realization that it takes a few decades to really come into, but here's something, maybe a harbinger of things to come if you're 20 years old and you're listening to this. There may come a point in your life where you discover that in reality, you're your own worst enemy. That the enemies you have in life can seem to get in your way and seem to irritate and frustrate you and cause you pain, but all of that irritation and frustration is nothing compared to the amount of pain that you bring upon yourself as you move from life. The number of mistakes and lies you tell yourself that ultimately generate hell on earth for you. That all that your enemies can do, your external enemies, is really very little compared to what you do to yourself. So at first it seems like, well, my goodness, this argument from Dostoyevski seems like just sort of a theoretical novelty. Not really, not when you think about it, because when you think about it and you realize like how much self-destructive behavior, how much self-sabotaging goes on, like how much we actually choose things, and we go out of our way to choose things that are actually against our happiness, that are actually against being constructive. And if you telescope that kind of realization out to human history, my God, have you ever realized how much of human history is basically about how the human race is going out of its way to generate hell on earth? It's kind of a lot when you think about it. For instance, you look at the historical record of, let's say, the 20th century, and yeah, you can find some uplifting, positive things in it. For instance, 1910, Madame Curie discovered radium and won a Nobel Prize for it. Actually, 2 Nobel Prizes, but who's counting? Yeah, wonderful story. 1910. Well, let's see. What happened pretty soon after 1910? Oh, yeah! World War I, trench warfare, mechanized warfare, mass chemical warfare, wholesale destruction at a level unknown, unprecedented to all the centuries of mankind before that. And that went on for year after year after year, many millions, tens of millions of casualties in World War I. My own grandfather being one of them, I guess. He was wounded in France during World War I. Okay, Yeah, but okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, but World War I went away. And then like some cool stuff happened. Like in 1927, Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic single-handedly. Wasn't that great? And yeah, it was great. That took balls of freaking steel to do something like that. Props and kudos to Charles freaking Lindbergh for doing that. My goodness. But what happened soon after 1927? Oh, 1929, stock market crash, Great Depression, worldwide economic devastation. Hell on earth. Well, what happened soon after that? Oh, let me think real hard. World War II, mass genocide. Okay, well, that wasn't exactly a novelty within human history, but the scale of it and the mechanized nature of it certainly was, and so on. But the point is that the human race, I get a little excited and tangential possibly. I might have to edit that part out, I'm not sure. But the human race, we human beings, both at a personal individual level and at the level of our collective historical humanity, in reality go out of our way to choose, as a function of our freedom, the negative. And we do it kind of a lot. We don't like to admit it, but it's there. All right, so for Dostoyevsky, those kinds of choices, you have to be honest about them. You have to recognize their ubiquity and that they're all over the place, really, when you're honest about it. And he says, moreover, that that's what makes our freedom real. That's actually what makes our freedom real. That's what allows us to pass beyond sort of the limits of this British utilitarian calculus of felicity idea of what our freedom is about. If you never choose what's difficult, if you never choose what's dark, if you never pick what scares you or what's not even necessarily in your own interest, really all you are is a glorified slave. All you are is a slave to your baser desires, as it were, to what you think you want. It's entirely possible to be enslaved, not free at all, because you're enslaved to what it is you think you want in your life. And all of your choices are ultimately enslaved to that. Each desire, like an iron bar in the prison house that you inhabit. What Dostoyevsky is interested in is a vision of freedom and consequently a vision of life that extends out far beyond that purview, that plays out across the broad spectrum of what life is. And the thing about the broad spectrum of what life is yes, there are many bright, wonderful pastel-like colors in that spectrum, but there are also many dark, difficult colors within it too. And the idea that life should be about only the pastel colors, like only, he compares it to a sort of utopian palace of crystal, he writes about in the book, or crystal palace in the book, kind of the utopian idea that, well, life should just be about just like happiness and all the bright colors and like everyone eating candy all the damn time. And it's like, well, that's a great infantile fantasy. Unfortunately, it's not human reality. Human reality, our human lot, is to have our lives play out across the broad terrain of things, both what is bright and also what is dark, all that's best in dark and bright, as Byron once wrote. Okay, so so that's a very different vision of freedom than probably most of us have. Now, he gives a very special name to the kind of choice that makes this real, the choice of the negative, what seems to be the purely negative. Not the negative in order to gain some positive in the future, but pure negative choices that we make out of caprice is the word that he uses in translation. Out of pure caprice, like out of pure whim, here's how the British say it, out of pure bloody-mindedness. Sometimes we make choices out of pure bloody-mindedness. Or here's how little kids say it, just because. We make choices just because, for no other reason than that. He gives a special name to those kinds of choices, and he calls them our most advantageous advantage. Okay, let's repeat that. Our most advantageous advantage. So the question is, what is our most advantageous advantage in life? Well, our most advantageous advantage in life is not to be enslaved to what we think we want, not to be enslaved to any calculus of felicity, not to be thoroughly imprisoned in the prison house of the brightest colors that we think our lives can have and should have. That's not it. Our most advantageous advantage is not to be like happy all the time. Our most advantageous advantage is to be free. So boy, this is setting up a real tension. Like, the point of our lives is not to be happy the way Aristotle had it with the idea of the eudaimonia, like the good spirits. Not the way the British utilitarians had it with greatest good for the greatest number. But the real point of our lives is to experience all that life has to offer. And our most advantageous advantage is to allow our choices to play out across that really broad terrain. And okay, part of that terrain, it's really easy to affirm. All the constructive, uplifting sides, that's not where the challenge is. That's not where the struggle is. Where the struggle is on the other side of the spectrum, like allowing ourselves to be honest enough to recognize that our choices of the negative not only happen at both the individual and collective levels, but that they're integral to the best part of what we are as human beings. And the best part of what we are is... I'm sorry, the camera went into automatic shut-off there. But I want to make this final point, and then we'll call this one done. The best part of what we are as human beings is to be fundamentally free agents, even if what that means is that our freedom extends beyond the outer boundary of our happiness. The point of human existence is not to be happy. That's a lie. The point of human existence is not to be happy. It's a lie we've been told and sold, and probably are continuing to be told and sold as we move through our lives. The point of our lives is to experience all that life is actually asking us to experience. And that includes, yes, the wondrous constructive side of things, but no less or more so than the dark and destructive side of things. And so the only question then is whether we're going to have the courage to acknowledge that reality and then learn to live accordingly. Okay, so let's end this particular video here. I don't want these videos to drag on too long because I think probably you'll get bored if they do. And we'll pick up with the other two elements of Notes from the Underground in the next video. So until then, I guess enjoy your apocalypse, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.